Hi everyone, welcome to our second installment of the Histories of Capitalism and Race seminar series. We're really thrilled to have you all here. I want to begin by quickly acknowledging my co-conveners. So my name is Hengam Ziai. I'm a lecturer in history, religions and philosophies here at SOAS, and this event has been organised with Sarah El-Kazaz, Samia Khatun and Lisa Tilley. And I'd also like to acknowledge the very hard work that Tanvi Kanchan has put in logistically pulling everything together. Before we get started, I think, having read the chapters that Catherine Hall has suggested for today, thinking a lot about the question of sort of disavowal, I think it's important to mention the many forms of disavowal that I think we are living with today, and to mention in particular everything that's been happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, which I think is the subject of a great deal of disavowal, but also the spaces that I really think are not seen. So I want to mention what is happening in Sudan, the siege of El Fasher currently by the RSF. The RSF is an entity that our government was very comfortable collaborating with during their migration management sort of policies less than 10 years ago. So El Fasher in Darfur is currently under siege, and of course the Congo as well. So keeping the relevance of everything that we're reading about racial capitalism in mind, I think is something that the seminar series very much is about. Before I talk too much and take up time from what's going to be an excellent panel, I'd like to introduce our main speaker, Catherine Hall. We're very, very honored to have you with us today. Catherine Hall, I think, doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway, is Emerita Professor of History at UCL and a prize-winning author. Her work focuses on Britain and Empire and includes the following books: Civilizing Subjects, Metropole and Colony in the English Imagination, 1830 to 1867, Macaulay and Son, Architects of Imperial Britain, Britain 2012, and Legacies of British Slave Ownership, Colonial Slavery and the Formation of Victorian Britain, co-authored with Nicholas Draper, and that came out in 2014. Between 2009 and 2015, she was the principal investigator on the ESRC-AHRC project, Legacies of British Slave Ownership. And I will maybe ask you to begin your presentation before I introduce, after that, our two wonderful respondents.
Okay. I think I am going to stand up. I thought I wouldn't, but I will. Otherwise, I feel too low down to the rest of you. So thank you very much to Samia, to Sarah, to Lisa, and to Henny for the invitation to be here as part of your seminar series on histories of race and capitalism. And I know that you had two chapters to read from Lucky Valley on the plantation and the merchant house. I know they're very long chapters, and I strongly suspect that not all of you will have read all of them. I've been asked to provide an overview of the main arguments of Lucky Valley in 20 minutes, which I must say is quite a big ask, because it took me 10 years to do the work for this book and to write it. So the idea of reducing it to 20 minutes is quite painful. However, I will do my best. And I mean, there is so much that I won't talk about, but obviously that is obviously the case. And I think the idea is that we have a lot of time for discussions, so hopefully things can happen in that time. I've noticed that clock is completely dead, so
I'll keep track.
I'll keep an eye. Okay, it's 10 past. I've got till 30:30. Well, I've called the talk History as Redress and Repair. The book was written as a call for repair for the damage that New World slavery has inflicted in its different ways on both the Caribbean and the UK. Now, I know that SOAS, I mean, it is interesting, after donkey's years of working in London, this is the first time I've spoken at SOAS, and I'm sure that one of the reasons is that you don't do the Caribbean at SOAS. So anyway, now here we are tonight with Jamaica and the Caribbean and England. That's our subject. So the book then is a call to undo, dismantle, and repair the logic of Edward Long's world, a racialized capitalist world. And this is a logic which has continued to operate in its reconfigured forms today, as Henny was saying. Black British politics in the 1980s and 90s put questions of history, race, and empire into public consciousness in new ways. And that facilitated the events around 2007 and the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, and the re-emergence of the language of reparation, which is a language that had been used in the late 18th, 19th centuries, but re-emerged with new meanings, of course, in the 20th century. In the new conjuncture that we face in the 2020s, terrible world that we are facing, with the rise of authoritarian populism and the shifting tectonic plates of the old order, the challenge must be what histories can open up new thinking and possibilities for change and repair in today's world. So if you're going to write history, what for? What are you trying to do with it? Can we have the cover of Lucky Valley? Because if you've only had the electronic copies, you won't have seen the beautiful cover done by the Black British artist, Joy Gregory, whose first major show has just opened in the Whitechapel Gallery, which I'd like to strongly recommend you to go and see. And you'll see the inspiration piece for this cover in that show. Can we have the next one? So Edward Long's History of Jamaica, 3 volumes published in 1774, remains the best known history of 18th century Jamaica. And it's a text which has done untold violence. Long's representation of Jamaica and Black people has occupied a privileged place since it was first published, and it's never been out of print since then. His racism has never gone unchallenged, but the book remains one of the foundational genealogies of English racial thought. It's a text that demands redress, that needs untelling. The reparatory project makes demands of all of us, whatever our discipline, whatever field we're in. And one particular contribution for historians is to explore the relation between past and present, the wrongs that have not been righted, and what the possibilities might be for a different future. Can we have the next one? So my work on Edward Long, here he is in the National Portrait Gallery, should you ever want to go and see him. And the History of Jamaica, developed out of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at UCL on the legacies. And we tracked the legacies of slavery through the compensation payments made to the slave owners when slavery was abolished in 1834. I can talk more about this in the discussion if you want to. From the perspective of a white British historian, i.e. me, who is convinced of the embedded and common sense nature of racism in British society, my work has been to track the significance of race, slavery, and empire to British history, including some of the historical constructions of whiteness and the central importance of history to national narratives. So that's the work I've been doing over quite a number of years. How did ordinary Britons come to believe in what Du Bois described as an entitlement to the ownership of the earth forever and ever? Amen. Long was one of the architects of this sense of personal whiteness. Edward Long was born in 1734, the 3rd son of a gentry and slave-owning family whose wealth had been derived over 3 generations from the labor of the enslaved on the plantations in Jamaica, which they had owned since the 1650s. His great-grandfather, Samuel, was one of the founding fathers of the colony. Edward was born and educated in England. While training as a lawyer in London and expecting to live his life in England, the unexpected death of his father, who was in Jamaica in 1757, left him with a very modest inheritance. He was advised by his uncle Beeston, who was the head of the West India Merchant House in London, to go to Jamaica, which was constructed as a place to make a fortune. Not a place to go as a tourist, as it is in the 21st century, a place to make a fortune. And what, of course, was never said in that, what that erased was the violence, the exploitation. A place to make a fortune, you can just make money. Age 23, Edward made an advantageous marriage, borrowed capital, and established himself as a planter, buying one of the family plantations, Lucky Valley, hence the title of the book, which he bought from his older brother. He stayed in Jamaica for 11 years, managing the plantation, engaging in an active political, social, and legal life, witnessing the Great Rebellion in 1760, and he returned to England as soon as he had made a sufficient fortune and settled in Chichester, of all places, to write a history of Jamaica. His house is still there on South Street, or the house that he lived in. The history of Jamaica provides a detailed account written by a slaveholder with explicitly racist views of the dependence of this mid-18th century capitalist system of sugar production on practices of racialization. Working on the text over time, I grasped gradually that what he was delineating was a system of what was increasingly being defined by activists and scholars as racial capitalism. A knowledge of the connections between the workings of capital in its different forms and racialized regimes has been around for a very long time. You need only think of C.L.R. James or Eric Williams. The focus on racial capitalism is more recent, connected with the understanding that tackling racisms without undoing the capitalist structures with which they are so intimately entwined can never work. My aim became to produce a case study of how this particular iteration of racial capitalism across the Atlantic world in the 18th century, with its spatial and temporal specificity, operated. A case study of this particular set of practices and ideas. What were the articulations between racialized subjects and economic, political, and cultural formations? What work did race do in this 18th century slave society? How was race made? How was it classed and gendered? How were the distinctions between black and white effected? How was race weaponized to secure meanings of mastery and subjection, which effectively braided together economic, political, cultural, and social structures in the interests of white power and privilege? What were the everyday racialized practices, from the use of violence and coercion to the division of labor on the plantations, or the claim for ownership of the infants of enslaved women? What were the markers of white freedom, such as horse riding, the membership of the militia, or sexual rights over the enslaved, that underpinned the legal codification of difference? What was the significance of family in all this? The celebration of the white family and the denigration of black kin, naming black babies as human capital. How did the organization of the white family, its patterns of marriage and inheritance, contribute to practices of capital accumulation? Those are all my questions, all of which are answered in my book. His history long used the power of his history writing to sustain and vindicate an enslaving colonial world, for he believed that the word is the medium in which power works. His history was his political intervention, his weapon at a critical moment, a moment of danger in the wake of the Somerset Judgment of 1772, which had demonstrated that slave owners in England could no longer rely on the law to subjugate their human property. Long aimed to naturalize racial difference. Racial difference, he maintained, was essential and natural. Inequality was ordained by providence, embodied in body, blood, skin, hair, and mind. Long was a key architect, both of the practices and the theoretical justifications for racialization. Making race was a matter of both everyday practices on the slave ship and the plantations, in homes and huts, in the courts and the towns, and codifications in the economic, political, and legal systems, and as spelt out in the treatises of slave owners and others. Long participated at every level in the making and attempted fixing of these definitions, aiming to secure white power and Black subordination. My work then, in a very difficult conjuncture, a very different conjuncture, it is very difficult, but also very different, was to break apart his racialized categories, supposedly fixed in body and mind, expose his erasures, his silences, his disavowals and denials, highlight the cracks and fissures, the spaces in between what is ascribed to enslaved people and the social and economic realities. The book is organized in two main parts, whoops. The lineaments of racial capital, which is racial capitalism, which is the first half, and making a slave society, which is the second half. Can we have the next picture? So Long devoted a major part, here we are in Jamaica in 1730, just before he was born. And this is Clarendon, which is where the Long plantations were. So Long devoted a major part of his history to the work of the plantation, which was, of course, at the heart of the system. It was the site for the creation of new subjects, the planter and the enslaved. Neither of those subjects existed prior to the development of sugar production in Jamaica. The planter, in his representation, made it all happen, created the value, oiled the wheels of the commercial machine. The agency of the enslaved men, women, and children who did the work on the ground was disavowed. Those who hoed, weeded, cut, and carried, boiled and distilled were, as he describes them, the sinews through whose bodies the labor process flowed. They were represented as disembodied labor, shows, chattels, to be bought and sold like every other commodity in the country. Enslaved people and stock were listed alongside in his accounts, a standard practice for slave owners. The planter was the mind and master of the enterprise. Lucky Valley was transformed during Long's 11 years on the island to a plantation able to deliver a tidy profit margin of over 10% each year. Can we have the next? So I wanted to show you this, which is one of, have any of you used, you probably haven't because you don't do Caribbean history. Anybody used the LBS database? One person. Good. Two. Well, the database is the database of all the slaveholders who got compensation in 1834. And the point of it is to show how Britain was involved in slavery, because the whole orthodox history has been that race and slavery have nothing to do with Britain. It all happened somewhere else. It happened in the Caribbean or it happened in the US. It's got nothing to do with us here. And that's the orthodoxy that we've been working hard to break for a long time. So showing the wealth that flowed into Britain, in which I'm sure Annabelle's going to tell us something more about, was a very important part of what we were doing. But one of the things we did in addition, I mean, it's a huge database. You should, if you have any interest, take a look. But one of the things we did was map Jamaica with all the estates of the slave owners. And then when you're using it on the internet, you can click on the white buttons and the estates come up with all the evidence we have about the numbers of enslaved people, etc., the amount of compensation they got. It's a very, very usable database, which has been, I'm glad to say, made huge use of in schools, universities, all over. I can see that I'm going to have to only say about 3 things more. Yeah. So long. So you did the plantation, you read the plantation, you've read, hopefully, The Merchant House, where he describes the system of credit and debt and the whole organization of the West India trade, from the financing of the slave trade to its workings enabled by a mercantilist policy. And this points to the importance of the metropolitan state in this whole project. The West India merchant houses, the new systems of credit, the bills of exchange, which were critical to the new financial systems, the circuit from London, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow to the west coast of Africa, the capture and enslavement of African peoples, the passage across the Atlantic, the sale of Africans, now called slaves, in Jamaica. It's only in the last chapter of Lucky Valley that I turn to Edward Long's attempted theorization of racial difference. And it's quite clear that I can't talk about it now. But if there's any time in the discussion, I will return to some of the points I would have made about that. Okay.
Thank you very much. So before I quickly introduce our 2 wonderful discussants, I want to say something about the way this seminar is going to be organized. So we do things a little bit differently over here. So we're going to start off by hearing from our 2 discussants, and then perhaps we'll give Catherine a chance to respond. But then after that, we're really going to turn it to the audience. And so the idea is for you to ask questions, but also to offer comments and reflections. You can speak to each other, you can sort of bounce off of one another. Catherine's not going to say anything for a little while. Maybe after 15-20 minutes, we'll return to Catherine. And if there's time, we'll have a second round of discussion amongst ourselves. So that's what we've been doing for the last couple of seminar series. And it's been really good for us to get our teeth into some of the ideas. So I'd like to firstly introduce Annabelle Gilmore, who recently graduated with her PhD from the University of Birmingham. She's now project coordinator at Lambeth Palace Library, researching and engaging with the Church of England's links to the transatlantic chattel enslavement.
Thank you. Yes, it's quite a mouthful of a title, which is very vague, and I think they did that on purpose, so I can do lots of different things. But yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be a discussant here. It's such a powerful read. It came out in the very last months of my whilst I was doing my thesis, and it would have been incredible if I had it as a source before. But I did make use of it in those final months as well for my own work. So I am a historian of the Caribbean, particularly in this period, and so reading what was going on here in Lucky Valley resonated a lot with my own work that I've done with this. My focus was on William Beckford, the younger William Beckford, as it were, who never even went to Jamaica, but still made so much of his wealth from the plantation system and the enslaved people there as well. And so seeing how Edward Long's spent so much time there and well, I say interacted, barely interacted with the people themselves there, but was part of that whole system, and understanding how racial capitalism built from that as well was really important to me, to see those building blocks, which I think you've clearly laid out in such a easy way to understand it. So thank you for that. One thing that I really picked up on was in the prologue, actually, was how you imagined during your visits to Jamaica seeing ghostly traces of that plantation life. And that was really important to see how, interacting with Jamaica itself, you were able to give a hint at what was going on back then, and recognizing that connection is still there today, which is more important now than it ever has been. And a key point is how you chose to look through Edward Long's version of history, because it's something that I personally would sort of recoil from at first. But now, having spent so long working with William Beckford, I understand why it's necessary, coming at it through that angle of that historic whiteness really builds up into how that racialization came to be and how whiteness was perceived at that moment. And it's that construction of race that begins there. And so it makes me think of know thy enemy, really, more than anything. So we understand, how did we get here? And in Lucky Valley, there's such a good breakdown of those processes and that building of racial capitalism. It was really interesting to see how Long used his privilege as a planter historian to present his own argument of slavery and plantation life, and how he managed that to build this narrative that he constructed as well, which is really key. And it's that disavowal which comes out throughout the chapters. That's one of the main thing that I would like to draw on here. So his writing, as you said, is done entirely for the purpose of money making, and it's that is the heavy reason for that disavowal. You said that Long envisaged the Atlantic as a place of white power made productive by black labor, but he knew nothing of Africa, and he knew nothing of that system itself, and it was entirely a construct to how these black individuals made that wealth and that power. One of the key points is how whiteness is in opposition to blackness. The black people he needed for his colonialist capitalist needs appear, but it is not obvious, and how he shuts that down. It's that moment when you're explaining, when he's talking about how the sugar is made, it becomes the passive voice. And it's that passivity which makes that absence striking, and how without these bodies, it's not possible. But it's that disavowal, that turning away that he is forced to do, which allows that history to be written. And I thought that was so interesting, that he's actively looking away. And that happens again with William Beckford as well. He's with Beckford, his whole point is he's trying to accumulate wealth to make his artistic gains through his collection. And this is sort of the financial side of it, which is very interesting to me. And that's where the diagram that you have of the merchants with the trade with all the credit, seeing all those connections in that one diagram, suddenly it's so clear. So it's really useful to get that diagram and understand all these different connections, and really understand how bills of exchange work. Right. Yes, because that's one thing that I didn't really understand before. So now I may. Yeah. So thank you again for that. And so it's really interesting. I don't know how long I've got left. I've been talking. Only a couple minutes. Okay. So it's what I found also very interesting was I did write it down somewhere, the talk of the intestinal enemy during when there's that discussion of there's so many black people, black bodies in Jamaica that they are the intestine enemy, they're internal, which is such an off-putting way to say it. And so, but then that connects with how they're seen as the sinews as well. So there's very much this biomechanical sense that's going on because these people are seen only as instruments, and so it's mechanical purposes, but they are objectified at the same time. And I thought that was such an interesting thing to pull out. And then it also connects to the plantation machine as well. And so it's this whole system that's working together that is also being completely ignored in the quite long. And to quickly go on, it's these moments where he's trying to moralize slavery, and there's just these horrid moments that you pick out where he's discussing enslaved women and what their uses are for. And it was the phrase weeders and breeders that was horrific to read, but it just really sets in place that observation and that objectification and that disavowal of these people who made his wealth and what he was trying to get the British system to do as well. And so, yeah, to sum it up, I think you've really done such a good job of explaining all these details and making it so easy to understand this journey that Long has gone on, and where he came from, how he started, and his main goal. But simultaneously, you've also deconstructed who he is and shown that it's that privilege and that entitlement that has led him there. And so I would like to just finish with it's knowing thy enemy and how we can work to undo the processes today as well. So yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Annabelle. Now I'm going to introduce Samia Khatun, who is a senior lecturer in history at SOAS. She is a feminist historian of race relations, focusing on the life, worlds, and experiences of colonized people across the British Empire. Her current book project is focused on the forgotten intellectual histories that shaped textile industries, spanning 18th century Bengal and Britain. She is also the author of the award-winning book Australia Nama, The South Asian Odyssey in Australia.
Thank you very much, Henny. So a very, very, very warm welcome to both Khatun and Annabelle and to everyone who has come here out from outside of SOAS. And it's also really good to see some of my students here. Hurrah! We will continue the conversations that we started in class. So in prep for tonight, I actually went and looked at the notes that I made when I first met Catherine, just after her last book, Macaulay and Son, had come out a decade ago. And that book was an examination of Thomas Macaulay's History of England. And it had at its heart a relationship between leading abolitionist of slavery, Zachary Macaulay, and his son, Thomas Macaulay. And quoting the younger Macaulay, Catherine had written that there was a, quote, a likeness in unlikeness between father and son, despite or even because of their differences. And back then, as Catherine and I taught together at Melbourne University, we came to delight in actually using this phrase to describe our budding intergenerational friendship. There was a likeness in unlikeness between us, we decided, and in the years since then, it's been a friendship within which we've deeply engaged with each other on a number of very productive differences of opinion, while sharing a broader anti-racist political project. So my hope for my comments tonight on Lucky Valley is to continue this dialogue of productive tension. And it's very much a reading from Beyond the Atlantic. And it's so interesting to hear what, how the book lands from a historian from within the field. So it's a monumental work, and as Annabelle has said, it lays out precisely how racial capitalism and its system of racial capitalism is established in 1770s Jamaica through the lens of Edward Long, a figure who's embedded in a world of white planters and London-based merchant capital, and a world that is reproduced through the gendered labour of the white family. And in her reading of a history book, The History of Jamaica, Khatun offers us a compelling model for blending close textual analysis with the networks of meaning, citation, and refutation that it was embedded in, with the material processes of capital accumulation and producing profit. You never lose sight of those who underpinned this entire triangulated geography of sugar production spanning West Africa, Jamaica, and Britain, the enslaved workers. For me, at the heart of this book is actually chapter 4, just like for Annabelle, where Khatun lays out the workings of merchant capital in a detailed circuit that she explains in very close detail. And in the process, she actually lays bare for us the foundations of a number of institutions that belie the political economy of modern Britain: credit, commission, the Bank of England, etc., etc., etc. And therein lies its incredible power. You've done the work that all of us are scared to do. I didn't want to go in there and understand the Bank of England. To have that there is an enormous, enormous, enormous resource. And one imprint that I hope this work will have on my own thinking on 18th century Khatun is, in undertaking textual analysis, I will always strive to pay close attention to the circuits of power that belied their production. You cannot ignore capital is the big takeaway, I think, for any historians of labour who might come to this, even though it is not, in fact, a history of labour. So when I taught this book in my class earlier this week in Gender, Race and History, I went into the classroom in deep disagreement with Khatun about her use of the Freudian terms disavowal, denial, and delusion, self-delusion, to describe Long's construction of racial difference as natural. And, my arguments are very easy. Freudian terms come from 20th century history of modern subjectivity. Are they really terms that you can use in understanding an 18th century subject? However, I went into the classroom, and as the class went on, as my students will tell you, we could see the political utility of the usage. What we discovered was the usage of those terms means that readers today, it's very difficult for them to disavow Long, because what happened in the classroom actually for us was we started seeing continuities between Long and us, particularly in the chapter on the family. It's a very complicated picture of Long that Khatun is going to paint for us as a kind father, holding that, a kind father, a kind sibling, holding that alongside this person who perhaps we would like to see as pure evil. Therein lies an very important political work that this does. So our discussion then ended up sort of heading towards whether or not the global South elite who run racial capitalism today in what we might call the colonies, the ongoing post-colonized spaces, those people, can they be understood through the framework of how you would understand Long? And the discussion went in some really interesting directions that ended up with saying you cannot disavow Long. You cannot disavow this history today. So in the end, these terms actually do the political work because they're anachronistic, because they have circulation today. So I started seeing the political utility of them. Mm-hmm. So then reading the book as an Australian and someone steeped in Australian historiography, I of course had a very particular set of responses to Lucky Valley that raises a number of questions. Khatun shows us that the African continent and African bodies were imagined as blank spaces and blank sites upon which to project European and British fantasies. This necessarily made me ask a series of questions about the Taino, the indigenous inhabitants. They feature in Long's work in one section, and Khatun takes a close look at that. And I wanted to know more, what are the strategies that allow Long to forget a genocide that this entire system is in fact built on? Is it the relegation of the Taino to the category of the ancient? And what are the strategies of land grabbing from indigenous inhabitants that are forgotten by the time of Long's era? Basically, I found myself straining to see the architecture of this discursive erasure of the Taino from Long's work. So another sort of reading from an angle, I guess I found myself reflecting on when you discussed, you wrote that citing David Scott, you wrote that the slave plantation might be characterized as establishing the relations and the material and epistemic apparatus through which new subjects were constituted. Those new subjects, you write, were the planters and the enslaved. So reading Lucky Valley, it occurred to me that Khatun's project is in many ways to remain within that epistemic structure, to produce a history book now to critique Long's history book then. The way that my own intellectual project or book project differs is to write from within these effaced epistemologies and then actually try and think about what other kinds of subjects might be constructed. So if Khatun is focusing on the history of Jamaica, written by the imperial history writer, I'm trying to read the history books that colonized peoples were producing. And this is a profoundly South Asia comment, because I'm not sure whether you can say that those types of history books exist, say, in the Australian context or in the Caribbean context. So I found myself looking and reading the book, looking for clues as to how one might read something from South Asian epistemic spaces, a history book. You've created this incredible apparatus to really look at history books. And as I said earlier, one of the takeaway lessons is, of course, you have to connect those textual productions with the political economy that underpinned their production. But of course, in the South Asian case, there are two problems. The archives of the political economies that existed before racial capitalism are unbelievably hard to find. The very establishment of this system was in many ways about the destruction of those papers. Definitely in Bengal, there's destruction of Mughal records of how the political economy works. And the second problem is while we have these incredible, we have so many of these books that were being written, even after the establishment of East India Company rule, they belong in another epistemic world. So the challenges of reading them are profound. So I found myself straining to see what other clues your book had for how we might undertake a project like that. And one of the things I noticed was I felt like this is another takeaway, because I think this is a question I've asked of your work often. One of the takeaways for me is every chapter was like it was a dialogue with a different community of scholars, a different intellectual community. So that in some ways lays a framework for how one might go about doing this project of working with other epistemes. And have I run out of time?
Getting there, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Maybe.
So my final point is I wanted to make a comment about a painting that we have always really disagreed about, which is what you talk about in your epilogue. If I could have.
Oh, I haven't got the image.
I have
You mean Francis Williams?
Yes, yes, the Francis Williams painting. So it will come up in a second. Allow me to introduce Francis Williams, or he's a slave owner who he's a property owner and a slave owner who is depicted in this image that you're about to see, and Long takes aim at this character, if not this painting. So this painting is by an anonymous painter and appears in Katharine's book. It's The Final Plate. And every time Katharine and I have talked about this painting, I've gotten so mad. And I want to try and actually articulate what it is that I see as quite a different reading of this painting. So this is a slave owner and property owner, and the painting is obviously a racist caricature. Okay, it's a racist caricature. Well,
Obviously.
well, you say in your book that it is a caricature. And one of the questions that comes up for me in the book is you make a deep critique of how Long constructs racial difference as natural, and that being the problem. And I found myself wondering what the antidote to that is. Is the antidote the construction of sameness? And I don't think you never say that.
No.
You never say that. You leave that open. The place where you come closest to taking a stance on that, I feel, is in the epilogue. And, you know, when you write that, you know, this image, which shows Francis William with a book by Newton, and, you know, in the library behind him, there's a book by Locke, there's Boyle, there's Milton, and so on. And you show that he writes poetry in Latin, and you say, I think, you say that his capacity to, Williams's ability to represent himself was his riposte to the planters. So I find that, for me, there's something, I still have such a complicated response to this image, because to me, him using Latin poetry to talk back to the planters, to me, is heartbreaking. I see this image and I see a precedent for the global South elite. I see, you know, I don't know enough about British politics to talk about the many people of colour in British Parliament who are deeply disappointing. But this image makes me think of Tulip Siddiqui, former Labour MP Tulip Siddiqui, and her family in Bangladesh, who are sort of dressed as in the garb of what was once the colonizer. And, you know, possibly even more tragically, I see myself in the image. I see, you know, earlier versions of Samia, who has had to dress up and speak the language of the colonizer, or every time I write a grant application or a job application, anytime I make a bid for more power or resources, the language that you have to speak at the cost of any kind of relationship to the intellectual traditions you might be carrying within you. So that it's been an interesting point of difference that we've had about this painting, and one that's made me think quite a lot. So I thank you for that. And on that note of difference, I will end with a quote from Catherine Hall, where she says, "What does it mean to be human, we might ask, if we cannot hope for a connection with others and welcome difference?" Thank you.
Well, we could settle in for an hour or two, Samia, with Annabelle, who knows lots about Francis Williams, as it happens. Oh, there's a lot to respond to.
You don't have to respond to everything.
I should hope not. let me think.
And in the meantime, I would say everybody get your questions and your comments ready, because once Catherine's done, we're going to be weighing in.
Well, I mean, the trouble is, you're in my head now because you spoke second. So I've got to think about the problem, the big problem which you raise about the different kind of work that you do from the work that I do, which is to do fundamentally with our totally different positionalities. And being a 1960s socialist feminist, I've always thought that we must work and speak critically from our own locations. You have to start from where you are yourself, and you have to know where you are insofar as you ever do, and try not to delude yourself any more than is kind of human. So, my job is to unpick whiteness. Your job is quite different. It's quite different. And it's so interesting because I've spent a good bit of today with a very uncomfortable but very powerful reading of Dionne Brand's latest book. Does anybody know her work? Well, she's a very wonderful Black feminist, Canadian poet, fiction writer, non-fiction. And this book is, I mean, it's partly autobiographical, though she's so clever. So all the time she's playing with, ideas of not being autobiographical while being autobiographical and all these kinds of things. But she grew up, as I did, on Jane Austen, Thackeray, all the 19th century novels, all of which I know by heart and have known forever, and so does she. But she is a Black reader, and after years and years of reading and being inside these books, inside the episteme of these books, which are the narrations of a new bourgeois world, that's exactly what they are, she now just keeps on asking the question, who is being constructed as the reader? Who is being constructed as the reader? And the reader is white. It's perfectly clear that these books were written for white readers. But the narrative takes you in and invites you to identify. And there's a great essay by Sylvia Wynter years ago. Sylvia Wynter's a Jamaican feminist, theorist, not an easy read at all. But Sylvia Wynter was in Jamaica, she's Jamaican, she spent time in England, now she lives in the States. But she wrote a brilliant essay absolutely years ago in the 1960s, which is about the connection between, I'm going to have to explain things in order for you to understand at all what this argument is about. The slave owners, actually, if you've read the chapter on the plantation, the slave owners created what were called provision grounds, which was where the enslaved were to grow their own food so that the slave owners wouldn't have to provide all the food. All they would provide would be, in good years, some herring, etc., smoked fish. And these provision grounds are called plots. And what happened with these provision grounds, which were, of course, were the lands of the slave owners, was that over generations, the enslaved claimed them for themselves. They worked them over generations, and they started to believe that they were their land. And this is the origins of a whole history in Jamaica, which is about the demand for land and the demand for rights to land. And this connects to something that Samia was raising, because the reason why Edward Long can completely ignore the genocide which preceded the conquest by the English in 1655 was that the Spanish had already committed the genocide, and there were virtually no Taino remains on the island. So the island was, from the point of view of those who were conquering, it was empty. It was vacant land. You know, it's Robinson Crusoe arriving on the desert island. It's mine. I claim it. I'll put up a flag. And this is the whole mood of the settlers in the New World, that they literally do not see, they disavow any prior history, except the one that they can say is worse than what they're doing, which is the Spanish. Of course, the Spanish were barbarous, they were cruel, they were terrible, you know, much worse than we are. But Jamaica was like a new land. When the English arrived in 1655, there were a few Spanish, very small areas of settlement, a few Africans that the Spanish had enslaved, and possibly some Taino people. We don't even really know whether there were any. So that everyone had to make a new world, which is why David Scott, you know, says it's a new world with new subjects, planters and the enslaved. They're literally mapping the island anew. And that's what, actually, I think my favorite chapter in the book, if ever you bother to read any more, is the chapter on colonial mapping, how they make the island a new place, how they, you know, how they just recast it as a tropical paradise with plantations. That's what they do. Anyway, this is a long way around, but, and you probably lost my connection. But the connection is that the enslaved, as they become emancipated, they demand rights to the plots. And Sylvia Wynter argues, to go back to her, Sylvia Wynter argues that the plots and the plots of the new form of writing, the novel, in the 17th century are intimately connected, because the plots of the provision grounds are the new African Jamaican culture, the claim for their land, the claim for possession against white ownership. The plot of the bourgeois novel is, we've made the world, it's ours, you know. I'm Jane Eyre, I'm whoever it might be. Probably most of you didn't grow up on 19th century novels, but I can tell you they're very, very gripping. So I'm inside the episteme, whereas Dionne Brand is so refusing it that she's written a whole book which is about all the silences in all these novels. It's only a short book. And of course, that's what I've done with Edward Long. It's all about what he doesn't say. It's all about how he says it, which shows you how he's constructing whiteness, how he's constructing mastery, how he's constructing subjection. You know, that's my job with this piece of work. And I so understand. You know, people say to me, how on earth could you bear to work with this for so long? But of course, the other reason for that, which is exactly what you've found, is that every human being is complicated, and they're much more interesting when you stop seeing them as pure evil or pure good, pure heroes, pure anything, and realize the ambivalence and complexity of human nature. So, you know, Edward Long's a very good writer. He's a very good observer. He gives us the best possible picture of Jamaica in the 1750s. Nobody else has done a piece of work like that. We need him, but we need to undo him as well. So I lived with him for a long time, and I'm quite glad to have got rid of him. That's one lot of thoughts. There are others we can come back to. Let's
You open it up to.
Yeah.
Okay, so put your hands up if you've got any comments or questions. Yes.
Hi there, thank you, Catherine and Discussants, for a really engaging conversation. I come at this not as a historian, but actually as a PhD researcher looking at contemporary labour movements. I'm currently looking at the extent to which work is racialised. I'm looking at how work is, how that racialisation is reproduced, and how workers themselves can mobilise around that racialisation. And my question really is, what for you or is the utility in using the term racial capitalism? Because you mentioned in the book that C.L.R. James, I don't think the book Du Bois doesn't use the term. So it's really, so that's kind of the first part of the question, the utility in the term, because it does have its critics. And I'm looking at this through a contemporary lens. The sociologist Loic Waquan, he dismisses it. Well, I think he dismisses it by calling it speculative, a speculative conceptual bubble, sort of, kind of intimating that actually has no concretization. It's just it's almost like a nothing term. And the reason why I ask these questions is because if you look at the work of Cedric Robinson, he understood racial capitalism, even though he only used the term 4 times in his book, that actually it was not about differentiation by skin color. It was just about difference, however you perceived it. So he actually talks about racializations actually forming in Europe, first of all. So it's so that there's sort of 2 parts to my question. And I wonder if you all have any responses to that.
So should we collect a few more? If
Sure.
that's all right. Yep. So we're gonna see if anybody else wants to. Sorry, is that your hand or are you pointing to someone? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I warn you, I'm hard of hearing,
Okay.
so please speak very loud.
I'm working on the links between the Methodist Church and chattel slavery. And in doing that, I'm very struck by how pious these people were. So my question is, was Edward Long, did he see himself as being a pious, believing Christian?
Okay, Ben, behind.
Thanks so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed and was also provoked by your introduction of disavowal into your historical methodology. And I think I was provoked by it in part because of the sort of question of anachronism in history that Samia raised, but also from a more, I guess, I don't know, clinically psychoanalytic perspective, the problem of treating disavowal as something that we identify in others, right? As a sort of something that we can read into the historical archive without necessarily questioning the same or trying to identify the same disavowals that sort of suffuse something like the practice of history itself. Because of course, Freud's concept of disavowal is meant to be something that sort of is not something that you can just sort of get past. It structures subjectivity as such, and it's rooted for him in the fact that we can't have knowledge of our own death, or at least that's how I understand the concept of disavowal. And so with that in mind, I guess my I wonder about the possibility of what you call a history of redress. I was thinking as you were speaking of Wendy Brown's critique of in Politics Out of History, which she sort of claims that histories of or arguments for reparations, she's not against reparations, but that arguments for reparations are predicated upon the fantasy that we can be sort of done and dusted with history, right? That if we sort of address the ills of the past, that we can then somehow finally get beyond the past, right? That the past is a wound that can be healed. And so I wonder, I suppose, the question that I'm kind of building to has to do with how you approach the question of history itself, because on the one hand, you sort of frame history as that which might allow us to sort of critique and redress racial capitalism, and yet at the same time, what seems to perhaps be shared between your book, History of Racial Capitalism, and Edward Long himself is the practice of history, right? right? I mean, his book is a history of Jamaica. So I guess I wonder about the relationship that you see between sort of history as I'm a historian as well, as we practice it in the present, and the history that Edward Long was practicing. And I suppose, what is the difference there? Is there a difference there? And how do we practice? Is history as sort of powerful as we think it is in addressing these questions?
Any other comments? Yep.
I think one of the threads that's been coming up across all of the discussants is about like these silences in texts that we read.
I'm sorry, I can't hear,
Sorry.
but somebody will tell me.
I'm trying to speak as loud as
Okay.
I've got a really quiet voice. You were all talking a little bit, I think, about silences in texts. So in Long's History of Jamaica, there's obvious silences within that text. And I was wondering about, I guess a question for all of you, about the value or perhaps the risks that you see in more speculative methodologies like critical fabulation and these ideas that Saidiya Hartman and Wendy Warren and others use. Can you use a text like Long's History of Jamaica to read against the grain and uncover things not about Long and whiteness, but about those he enslaved and blackness? Yeah, it's just a thought.
There's quite a lot there.
You don't have to address everything. That's yeah, not something
People
you
can
have to do.
feel free to address each
Each
other's
other.
questions. You know, you might have had thoughts from having, because many of you have read the chapters. So yeah, please feel free to jump in.
Yep.
Could I just get back to the point that Samia made, I think other people have well as well, that the extent to which the use of Freud and psychoanalysis and contemporary modern categories of human construction are essentially about the usability of the past. And what struck me was the extent to which, in trying to create a usable 18th century, that a modern reader recognizes as somehow rational, at least internally, what you end up doing is decentering the complete weirdness of the 1750s and 60s and 70s, and the extent to which, all of these things are so absolutely, all these ideas are being constructed in a world that no modern person, anyone, would actually find in any way comfortable. I'm thinking in terms of the history of medicine and moral theory. I think about religion and the extent to which religion, weird religion, intersects with economic thinking in just this moment. And all of it, between the 1750 and 1780 is part of this massive conversation. And I kind of missed that.
I'm not really sure what people, was there a question there? Do you think?
Probably not. Okay.
I think it's a comment. I think it's a reflection.
A reflection, but a reflection on the sort of huge differences between then and now.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you like to paraphrase very quickly?
Good. Just that in trying to make Long readable for the present, I think one's in danger of doing damage to an understanding of the 18th century on its own terms.
Okay.
Anybody else want to weigh in? I have tons of comments and questions myself, but I don't know how abusive I should be. But again, don't feel you need to, answer everything, Catherine. Part of this is just us, discussing things amongst ourselves. So I'll just jump in with one of them. I do want to talk about credit because I was also mind blown by that chapter on merchant houses. But just on disavow, I found that a very, very productive way of reading someone like Edward Long. So your use of Kleinian psychoanalysis, the idea of so-called splitting and projection, and as a way into thinking about foundational sort of contradictions that we see in these texts, the knowing and not knowing at the same time, which I think very much speaks to our moment, right? There's a lot of knowing but also not knowing that I think structures the way I guess we could call racial capitalism articulates itself. So I thought it was useful for the text. I think it's very useful for how we think now, or how we fail to think, which is also another thing you talk about: knowing, not knowing, thinking, and also not really thinking. And to just address, I think, Samia's point, if I may, about, you've set up two different paradigms for the kind of anti-racist feminist work that you both do. And for me, they seem to be, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a cliche to say, but kind of co-constitutive
Yeah.
or kind of hermeneutically useful
Mm.
to think between those two different paradigms. Because on the one hand, I think reading a work like yours, which is very much within the colonial episteme, has a kind of therapeutic quality. So once you read your work on Edward Long, when you do go to the so-called pre-colonial archive, I think you read it with different eyes because you've done some of the work of deconstructing the categories that we take for granted, right? So the legacies of the epistemic legacy of someone like
Completely part of our world.
which is completely part of our world, is completely part of our vocabulary. So you deconstruct that before you see the kinds of texts that perhaps Samia is looking at. Because people look at texts with, I suppose, different eyes, and they at the same time see and don't see certain things. So that's sort of my contribution. I can see how both sort of projects can feed into each other. Equally, reading Samia's forthcoming book and her work might offer a different lens into reading Edward Long. Yeah, I think now that I've abused my position as chair, maybe we will turn back to Catherine.
Well, of course, I can mainly feel envious that you've got texts which come from a different place. I've got, I haven't got anything. There's material. Can we just show? Can I just show you the very last. The last one, that, okay. So this is Lucky Valley now. In other words, there is no trace whatsoever of that plantation, of what happened to all those people, of any burial ground. There is nothing. There's cane fields. I mean, I can still absolutely see the lie of the land. Can you go back to the watercolor? Yeah, that one. So this is the watercolor that William Berryman did in 1808 of Lucky Valley. And of course it's sanitized, it's completely sanitized. You don't see any pain there, but you can absolutely see the landscape. So I know when I finally, honestly, the adventure of finding Lucky Valley was a complete adventure in itself, because of course nobody knows where it was. We had to have an 18th century map in order to find it. So it was a fantastic adventure. And then can you show the one that comes after that? So then I went with an archaeologist, and he took this area, he had a little baby drone, and he took this aerial photograph, and you can see so absolutely crucial the waterways, which of course without the water they could never have produced the sugar, and so on. But the reason why I wanted you to see the, as it were, the empty landscape, is to show the erasure of a history, the complete erasure of a history there. And so, it's interesting, Annabelle, because when you said, it's so relevant now, well, it is, but there's a whole argument in Jamaica as to whether people want to remember slavery or not. Lots of people do not want to remember slavery. They think that was something in the past. We're now living in a completely different time. It's a matter of shame, not of anger, not of, all kinds of things of shame, which is what comes up. So let's just do away with that. And it's only quite recently that there's been more work with the equivalent of the National Trust there, the Jamaican National Heritage Trust, which is trying to work on some of the last bits of the properties that are still there. But one of the fascinating things about Jamaica in comparison with India is that there were no artifacts to bring back. So whereas British museums, I'm sure you'll know so much about this, British museums are full of the most gorgeous, wonderful, amazing artworks, etc., nicked from India. I mean, what can you bring from Jamaica? You know, mahogany, the mahogany chairs, the mahogany staircases. Those are one of the few, and it's not that came from there, it's just the mahogany was all cut down. And then craftsmen produced this beautiful furniture, like Chippendale's furniture and so on, that sits and graces country houses of the kind that, I mean, maybe you should come in, Annabelle, because you know so much about them.
Yeah, that is one of the main things, that there's nothing to show so much. It's the very interesting thing is how the wealth in Jamaica and the other Caribbean islands was transformed into other forms of artistic display, often through East Asian objects. So it's that, as has been said about William Beckford, it's that looking eastwards, even though you're using that West Indian money. And so on my own visit to Jamaica, when I went through Spanish Town, which has some of these remnants of the colonial houses, and that's what you can see, that's what you look at. And again, that's from that white perspective, because they are the ones who leave that legacy behind. Recently, the British Museum had their Hugh Locke exhibition, and centre to that was that Taino sculpture.
It's fabulous.
Yes, and having previously 2 years ago been to Jamaica and seen their replica that they have, that was very interesting to see how the British Museum, which had this sculpture, which is normally not on display, and how it was displayed then. And that's the inroad into showing Jamaican history and showing that Jamaican discussion, this culture that was then erased by the British there. And so I get what you mean in seeing, like, there's nothing to work with, particularly if you're trying to go in from that Black perspective, and therefore it makes it necessary to use works like Long and the archive, which comes to that critical fabulation moment, where you need to work against the grain and you need to conjure these histories yourself in many ways, because otherwise it is only that one perspective that is so antagonistic to any kind of Black narrative. And so I definitely feel, yes, you can use critical fabulation to read any of works like Long, because what he's saying, there's so much missing and you can fill that missing space there. And that's the same case with the country houses in Britain. You can work backwards and find what's missing and fill that space with the fragments that you do find in the archive, because what is often left are these documents which list the enslaved people as objects, but there is that data there, which the Legacies database is very useful for discovering. And so it is an opportunity, is to figure it out. You can, but you have to go through this avenue and understand where people like Long are coming from to then reconstruct it.
So just quite interject to respond to what you were saying, Catherine, about no artifacts. I'm not sure if you described the truncheon, the police truncheon, as an artifact, but if memory serves, the lignum vitae, I think that might be the Latin name for the tree, that was the actual wood that was used to actually make the police truncheon, which actually is a very bitter irony, because of course that was the tool of oppression for a lot of racialized people. So there's this bitter irony, just like the irony of Lucky Valley. I mean, obviously, lucky for whom? So there are so many facets to it. But I just thought I just want to thank you. It's such a brilliant exploration and so necessary, although very painful. But really, really glad you've actually unearthed it and brought it to life. Thank you.
Does anyone want to answer the question about the term racial capitalism, or speak
I'm
to
going
that?
to. I mean, you know, I don't know whether it will last, but it doesn't matter whether it does or not. What will last is the attempts that have been made over years and years to try and understand the connections between race and capitalism. And, you know, I mean, Marx addresses it, doesn't go into great detail, etc., but it's there. He understands that the new world is the beginning of the modern world. I mean, that's how he understands it. So I just think that a particular term at a particular time can become very useful. And the reason why I thought it was important to use it now is because I think that Long's History of Jamaica does actually give us a case study. And that's what I think is lacking. I think people go on and on about racial capitalism as if everybody knows what it is. And it's not at all clear what it is. When, what kind, which forms of racialization, which forms of capitalism. So I think by doing a really serious case study, I've done something that contributes to the debate. And actually, what's his name? The Frenchman did tell me that he thought he was sorry he hadn't read what I'd written before. So, you know, you might win a tiny bit.
Yes.
But I really don't know. I mean, I don't know whether people here know where the term really came from the debates in the late 70s and 80s in South Africa, when in relation to the struggles over apartheid, they were thinking, can we transform apartheid without addressing capitalism? And that's when the term is first used in some articles at that time. And of course, it was Marxists in South Africa who were debating all that. And then it sort of drops out of use. And then Cedric Robinson uses it. But as you say, he doesn't, it's not really particularly important to him. But then I think the reason it's come up now is because people are seeing, I mean, we've had a whole period of diversity is the answer. You know, we can deal with these problems of race and racism by having more brown and black people in posts. Well, we can't. I mean, we absolutely can't. And unless you address the structures that these systems of racialization are locked into, it's not fundamentally going to change. So that's what I mean. I was so struck on one of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I saw this person standing up with abolish racial capitalism. And I thought, I wonder what they think it is. I mean, what they think it is something to do with capitalism and race. But you've got to be specific about when, who, how. Otherwise, it's not very useful. So that's my line on racial capitalism.
Penny, can I try and connect Tim and this person's question about critical fabulation? I actually have quite a controversial stance on critical fabulation. My students love it. Everybody in the classroom loves it, but I don't. I don't as a strategy. I like reading it and I enjoy reading it. But the reason I'm really suspicious of it as a strategy is that it is very hard to do critical fabulation without doing the blank mind thing that you're projecting yourself and today's subjecthood into in order to animate a past character. Now, Tim's comment and my original sort of critique of the use of disavowal, etc., to think about Long, in some ways, we might say Khatun is doing a form of critical fabulation on Long and in trying to imagine what his interiority might be. And the irony is, having taught in the classroom now, I see its political utility. So I'm not sure, for what purpose do we want deep histories of subjecthood in the 18th century? Actually, there are a million purposes, right? There are a million political purposes now. There's a million reasons we might, but I guess that wasn't, in my reading, what Khatun has set out to do. But I actually see the two questions as quite strangely connected, even though you wouldn't think that what Khatun's doing is critical fabulation first. But yeah, but also it's, again, a very South Asianist answer, because if you don't have texts to go and read that these people might have been embedded in, but then in Jamaican historiography, isn't there an engagement with oral knowledges? That would be my question what about the beyond textual, that which has been transmitted but finds it difficult to make it onto the pages of history books?
I guess that's what I'm wondering, is if you have those other forms of knowledge, like those oral histories in Jamaica with people currently still living there, and that kind of like ancestral knowledge, can you use that in conversation with a white authored text to kind of plug the gaps and like make them speak to each other, so that you can say if Long mentions, you know, there's like an offhand mention of one of the enslaved people, you can kind of put that together with what people like descendants of those enslaved people say in Jamaica now, and you can kind of plug those gaps. I see value in that, but I also understand the risk in it as well.
I feel mixed about critical fabulation. I mean, like you, it's very can be very absorbing to read. I heard a wonderful talk from a Black feminist in the States who's worked on slavery for years, and who, I mean, she wasn't being directly critical of critical fabulation. What she was saying was, if you listen carefully enough to the archive, if you look hard enough, there is so much going on. There are so many traces, there are so many voices, and it takes a lot of very hard work to find them. And, you know, the critical fabulation people were all, oh, you know, she's attacking us. But I don't think she was really. I think she was saying there are two different things that can go on. But I mean, she talked about the noise of slavery, of enslaved people in the Southern archives, which she's been using for, you know, years and years. It was a wonderful lecture.
What was her name?
And then I think about Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison didn't have to use critical fabulation. You know, what she did was, I wouldn't call it that. What I mean, I just reread A Mercy, which is just the most extraordinary novel. It really is. And she's steeped in the archives of Virginia in the 17th century. I mean, you can tell from what she's written how much she knows. You know, she's not a novelist who just sort of, she spent years doing work, reading stuff, you know, being, of course, a historian in all kinds of ways, and then writing these extraordinary novels. But A Mercy is particularly interesting because it's about constructions of whiteness and blackness, whereas most, of course, of her work is about blackness. And it's about the formative moment. So it's terribly relevant in relation to Long, actually. I mean, it's Virginia. People think it's Virginia in the 1650s, 1660s. It's a great novel.
To build on that idea of critical fabulation and the archive and how there are so many moments in there, I think it is important to recognize that people talk about silent histories, but they're not silent. And so this was the thing I talked about in my thesis, about that they're more quieted histories and they've been purposefully quieted. And if we dig down and deep into the archive enough, we can bring those voices back in a way, even though it might not be in the capacity that we want. There's still those stories in there. And for me, I do think then understanding the historical purity of the archive in some ways, but that is quite a loaded term because of who created that archive is an important part of that history as well. And so it's that history on history. First with who created the archive, who maintains that archive as well. And so with the critical fabulation, it gives that opportunity to almost mess with that history to some capacity, which can be quite cathartic. So I suppose it depends what angle you're coming towards it, and how historical you want to be in that moment in time, as long as you know that it's embedded within that specific time frame and that specific narrative and that specific subject. To then push the envelope a little bit with that critical fabulation can give that spin in a way that feels necessary to me, when Long has such a loud presence. So I think that's what I come with critical fabulation with. Yeah.
More questions from the audience?
Well,
or
we had
comments?
disavowal, which we haven't, I mean, you know, I'm writing in the 21st century. I mean, you know, I'm not writing in the 18th century, of course I'm not. But I will make every effort to understand the 18th century from within. But I'm obviously going to use my 21st or 20th century mind to try and grasp it. And so, you know, I don't take the argument that it's anachronistic to use, whether it's Freud thinking in the 1900s or Klein thinking in the 1920s or Marx thinking in the 1840s. You know, it's what tools are there that are available to us to understand that past in the present, because we can't understand it in any other way. We can only understand it in the present. And one of the reasons why I think disavowal is so helpful is that I think it's so relevant to thinking about how we all think. I mean, it's not just Edward Long that disavowed. As you said at the beginning, you know, we're absolutely surrounded by disavowal. We're surrounded by people who run universities, not thinking about who universities are really for or what they should be doing, but trying to survive within a neoliberal financial world, etc. Or, you know, I think about Farage, and at that point, I must say, my kind of conviction of the complexity of individuals rather collapses, and I cannot see myself. But I do think that disavowal is absolutely central to the workings of racial thought. And racial thought is all around us. And I mean, we see it every day, you know, we can't miss it. And we can see the way in which some people are treated by other people and so on, and the failure to see, the refusal to see, and yet the projections, which then are the way of the racist coming to terms with, you know, how treating somebody else as not properly human, it's not a problem. That's what they have to do, because they have to justify it to themselves. And it's because, well, they're not properly human. They're something else. And that thinking has its origins. I mean, it has its origins in, one of its origins in New World slavery. It's only one. I mean, there are so many reconfigurations of how racism works and who's being racialized and in what ways and so on. But it seems to me that in relation to anti-Blackness, Long still has, unfortunately, an awful lot to say to us, which is that, you know, Black people are lesser, they're down the human chain, they're very, very close to the orangutan, so they're animalized, and it's the body that tells us. It's what's inside them. It's the fact that Black people, according to Long and according to anatomists in the 18th century, have black bile and a different colored blood and all these things which, you know, they think are scientific. And that then gets embedded in scientific racism, of course, in slightly different forms in the 19th century, but it runs very, very deep. Questions of animality and questions of not fully human. I mean, look at how we treat asylum seekers. Look at how the Israelis have treated their Palestinian prisoners and so on. I mean, how do they justify it to themselves? They have to. They couldn't go to bed at night otherwise. Netanyahu doesn't think he's doing anything wrong at all. He's completely convinced it's all fine. How? Because he won't see, he won't think. And I think, to me, really the most important point about Freud is that he's saying it's very, very, very hard to look at reality, terribly hard to really look at reality, whoever you are. And that's, I mean, he's not privileging anybody. He's, he's dealing with all kinds of people who we would think had no problems at all. Why should they? But anyway, sorry, that's a
really great answer. I'm keen to get more comments from everyone. Yep.
Thank you very much. I haven't read any of this, but in my defense, I just found out about this event last night, so. I want to ask you about class, and I'm a historian, but I'm not a historian of slavery or the Caribbean, but as an American, I just know a little bit about American slavery, and my impression is that I think in the 17th century, it took a while for slavery or subordinate status to become really associated with Blackness, right? That there were a lot of poor whites who were kind of a source of embarrassment for wealthier whites. There were a lot of white indentured servants. There were all of the kind of ne'er-do-wells who were sent to Australia. So I'm wondering if there's any trace in Long of an awareness of class and of white people in conditions close to, not the same, but close to slavery, and if he's embarrassed by that or just kind of doesn't talk about it in the way that he doesn't talk about the indigenous inhabitants. So his construction of whiteness, I wonder if it has any relationship with class.
Okay, the person behind.
Yeah, something Annabelle said earlier about bodies and the necessity of the bodies in this history, in creating and writing this history, but also in the plantation machine itself. And I'm glad that bringing up the archive and in response to kind of what you're talking about of locating potentially different epistemes to talk about this history. How do we do that when we don't have text and we don't have material objects in Long? And you mentioned the burial ground. Is he talking at all about the treatment of people's bodies in death and how, at least in the work that I'm trying to do, locating people's bodies as a source of an episteme to then talk about their experience in life? Does he mention where people are being buried or how? I know you mentioned it briefly, but I haven't read the book myself. Thank you.
Any other comments? Sorry.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I haven't had a chance to read as much of the book as I would like, but I guess I was struck that in the introduction very early on, we hear that Edward Long is very important to. I kind of read it as sort of the making of what we come to then call racial capitalism.
the making of,
Right, racial capitalism.
yeah.
And I'm coming at this not as a historian, but as someone who does critical political economy, a little bit of political theory, and trying to think about genealogy and how you think of the making of something like racial capitalism, especially because there's a lot in the book around race discursively, which is really, really interesting, and kind of bringing in the body in particular ways in language, right? But also the materiality of how the plantations operate, the merchant houses, the credit system. We learn about, all the roots of a lot of these institutions that we think of as very important. And I guess I want to kind of think with you about how we come to think of something like racial capitalism in the way kind of the discursive and the material are working together and against each other and in tension with each other. Just kind of I think about that a little bit. And I actually want to bring back Henry's question about history and repair. I'm kind of curious where you sit on that.
Gonna jump in with a with a comment that follows on from Sarah. I feel like we didn't talk enough about credit, but that might be for the next time. I think I'll you down because that was an amazing chapter, the chapter on the merchant house, and it's a chapter that I feel I have to reread because it was so rich in detail, and you sort of lay out in a way that I think very few people do the origins of money in credit on the one hand, as I read it, how these bills of exchange work, and I think I found in your book in several different places you're taking these economic concepts that we see as existing in a separate sort of epistemic realm from race and offering a racial reading of them, or telling us that they are, correct me if I'm wrong, that they have racial genealogy. So you do that with credit. So it's almost like a racial history of credit that you're offering us, a racial history of money, a racial history of human capital, which of course is a word that has now come to have all sorts of neoliberal, connotations. It's a gendered history of human capital as well, which again, we
And class, and class.
The connection between was a maternity, childcare, and the production of enslaved people as human capital, which mirrors in very interesting ways human capital theory today in economics. Just, the mother has to invest in the child in order for the child to be successful and educated and so on. So I read you as, as one of the things that you're doing in this text through Edward Long is actually unsettling our own conceptual apparatuses. One being economy as this realm that is considered as separate from race, and the other being, of course, culture, race, gender. You were showing how these things are from the very outset, even something like credit, always intertwined. So I just thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to hear if that's how you see your project too. For instance, would you see your understanding of money and credit as being a racial one? Sorry, anybody else want to jump in? Sorry, keep quote unquote gagging you.
Henry, was it the history question? I also want to hear what other people think about this. It's one of the questions that was at the top of my mind as I was reading the book, because I was thinking, what does imperial historiography, as Long is producing it, what are the continuities with that you are, one of the founders of and a practitioner of, which is new imperial history? And I think that's a really important and interesting question to always be asking, because of course, new imperial history is entirely about the critique of old imperial histories. And I don't know what the answer is for Jamaica, but one of the interesting tensions that I think, and blind spots that new imperial history, I think as a field has, is that, and I might be completely wrong here, in the case of South Asia, new imperial history thinks about the Western audience. It is written for an audience that is often dealing with either US or British problems or political issues that are raised by the British and US world. So in South Asia, where various works of imperial historiography like James Mill or whatever might be seen as the root of communalism, that's their political problem. That is not something that imperial history as a field really takes on. That's sort of seen as what belongs in the world of South Asian historiography. So I wonder how Jamaican historians or West Indian historians or Caribbean historians, how they understand the legacies of Long and what how they would see what the continuities between the old imperial and the new imperial is, and are there ways in which some things are still being left out?
Can I just respond to that?
To that particular point, can I make one more point and then we'll let you respond and then we'll finish?
All right.
Just one on gender. I just want to bring it up right at the very, very end, because Molly's mentioned class and we've talked quite a lot about race and capitalism, but I was very curious to hear, it might be very obvious for somebody like Samia, but I'm quite sort of new to this field, the feminist approach that comes out in your text, how would you sort of articulate that for students or people who are sort of new to the field of feminists reading sort of racial capitalism? And I just want to say that the way that I read your work as a feminist text is actually through precisely the attention to something like affect. So the role of sort of anxiety, the question of sort of disavowal, even anxiety in relation to credit, something that, again, I don't think really has been discussed very much. I mean, David Graeber touches on it. The question of gender vis-a-vis credit, the sexualization of credit. So in some ways, the body is, the body and affect are all over what might otherwise seem like, a work of political economy. So anything that you could say to also address the feminist sort of dimension, we'd be very grateful for. The floor is all yours.
You're a very demanding lot. Gosh, there are just so many interesting things that have come up actually that I can't possibly, I mean, they're big questions that are being put. I mean, just one thing is that I think new imperial history, which developed here and in the States, was first developed by feminists, absolutely, definitely. And it was part of the cultural turn. So we absolutely left the economy behind, which was a terrible, terrible mistake. But, this is the thing. Culture had been so ignored, so not understood, questions of subjectivity, identity, all the questions which came up with feminism and came up with Black politics and new identities and who you are and where you belong. That was what absolutely fed new imperial history. And, the previous big piece of work that I'd done was with Leonora Davidoff, was absolutely about the economy as well. It was about economy and culture. And somehow, for like 15 years, I managed to forget about the economy, thought somebody else can do that. But meanwhile, what was happening was the economic history was being completely split off from history, which was a terrible development. Economic history departments closed down. Economists got more and more into econometrics and, what have you. And so that, I mean, there was wonderful economic history connected with labor history in the 80s. And I mean, so much of that just disappears. So anyway, what happened, which is very, very interesting, really, and thank goodness, when we were doing the Legacies project, there was me and there was Nick Draper, who's an economic historian and who had worked in banking. And it was, I mean, he made me understand financial systems and credit. And I mean, I give full credit to, that's Nick's diagram, though it has to be said it was a collaborative diagram, but he did the final things. But we talked about that diagram for weeks, working it out. I couldn't possibly have done it on my own. There's so much of other people in this book, for which I am so grateful, because as you said, every chapter is actually about something different. Some of it's about history, some of it's about geography, some of it's about law, some of it's about, and so on. Some of it's about money and the organization of trade. I mean, there was no way I would have written that chapter without LBS. So then I read all this very, very interesting literature, which is, I'm sure it's in the footnotes, on credit, because there are quite a lot of literary historians who've done work on credit, and it's brilliant, some of it. I mean, the South Sea bubble, there's the whole image that's in, what's his name, anyway, it's too much. I can't remember everything. But it was, I mean, I had to learn so much to write this, which is why it took so long. So whether it was reading, whether it was trying to understand about the pastoral and the Gothic for the chapter on colonizing the island and remapping the island and creating a plantation, you know, the vision of the plantation, or whether it was about credit, or whether it was about natural history and the anatomists and the natural historians. I mean, I didn't know any of it before I started. So it was like, okay. But then I think that finally I've been able to write a book which is just history. It's not economic history, it's not social history, it's not cultural history, it's not political history, it's all of them. It's just history. It's about a whole society, which is what history, you know, all the subdivisions we've got have been deeply unhelpful in some ways, because it becomes very difficult to look at the whole, because you need all these different skills to be able to do it. So anyway, I think that's, what did that come out of? Question about credit and learning about it. And I mean, it was so exciting. Little did I think that, you know, understanding the Bank of England would be an exciting thing. And then what happened, you know, for years, the Bank of England has completely denied that they had any serious interest in slave ownership. They never owned any enslaved people, etc. Then, in the context of our project and Black Lives Matter, of course, they decided they have to, and because they had a black group within the Bank of England who put pressure, which is exactly the same as what happened in Lloyd's of London. It's the new appointments who make something happen, you know, who cause trouble. And then they discover all this stuff, including, of course, evidence of that the Bank of England did indeed own enslaved people, because through mortgages, so I had to find out about mortgages. And what I'm finding out about now, which is the latest excitement, this is the thing about history, you know, there's always more questions. I've realized that the whole development of private property, of the notion of private property, is in the 17th century. The idea of individual people owning land as opposed to feudal systems of ownership, its origins are in the 17th century, and they're in England through enclosure, in Ireland through the whole conquest of Ireland and the creation of the plantation system in Ireland, and in Jamaica. It's all happening at the same time. And there's one, Edward Thompson, the great Edward Thompson, of whom I've got loads of criticisms, but you know, he was a brilliant historian. Just as, I mean, I think Macaulay was brilliant. I think Edward Long was brilliant. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It means that there's something there worth thinking about. And Edward Thompson says at one point in his wonderful essay on customs in common, and he says, there is an evolution. He says, private property has a history. I mean, who would believe now we are completely embedded in a society in which it is unimaginable not to think of private property as being what there is, as it simply is how you organize society. But they made it happen. I could tell you lots more about that, but I won't.
I think we should thank.
I should just say that Edward Long wasn't religious at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Are you sure?
So I want to thank Catherine Hall and for your very, very generous and patient responses to our very intense series of questions, and our wonderful discussants as well. So yeah, thank you.